All right. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Emily Ike from EHT Traceries, and I'm here tonight actually with Alyssa Stein, who is the help me get through all these slides. And actually, Mia Maloney helped put this together from our staff, and so she's not here tonight, but Mia played an important role in this. So let us start, and we'll give you some background on the history. As you may know, obviously Logan Circle is a historic district, but it's actually part of a greater historic district, which is the Greater 14th Street Historic District, which was listed originally in 72 was Logan Circle. Then in 94, the Greater 14th Street was expanded, and you can see the color of the color coded to sort of show you the areas. The original Logan Circle, and then the Greater 14th is sort of a salmony, pale salmon. Greater 14th expansion in 2007 brought in the lots that were down there. And then that is where we are today. All of the colored area is, in fact, the Greater 14th Street Historic District overlaying on Logan Circle Historic District. The blue, dark blue stands for contributing resources that are within the historic district, and the paler blue for those that are non-contributing, typically because they're newer or that they have lost their integrity. So let's begin and get into the history. This is a little overview of what we're going to talk about tonight. We have early development, rapid growth, transformation, social changes, and historic designation, and how that has affected Logan Circle area, how it's the whole Greater 14th Street area works together. I think we'll get a little understanding of that, what it started with and what it is today. So let's begin. So early development. This is the period before the Civil War, and there's very little left in the Greater 14th Street Historic District from that period. You can see the Logan Circle as the center in this pink box in that general area. And as you notice that the darker areas in that map indicate where there's a lot of physical development, but you notice that it's all to the south. There's very little that's within that box. There's some, though. And this photograph on the right of 1372 N Street was a building that was known to have been built in 1859. It is no longer standing, but it is one of the few buildings that are from that period. So very few options left, and most unrecognizable if they are there. But as you can see, it was a single family home and of quite nice stature at that time. But the second period that we'll move to is the rapid growth period. And it was really brought in as Washington was growing, which in 1862, the streetcar was introduced into the city. And the area that we can see those lines indicate the streetcar lines. And as you will notice, one of them goes north-south right through that pink box that was the center of the now Greater 14th Street Historic District. The streetcar was originally the Washington and Georgetown Railroad Company, was the branch of streetcar that ran, and it went all the way from New York Avenue to Boundary Street. So essentially, what you know of as it ended at what was the Federal City, that line. So the improvements that we go to the next slide, were very much the product of Alexander Shepard. Shepard had been the commissioner for public works for the District of Columbia, which was run with commissioners. And he really pushed and was successful at getting a lot of money into the city's infrastructure, sort of similar to what we're going through today, perhaps. But this is one of my favorite maps because it gives you an idea of what, not just Logan Circle area, but for the greater area that we look at. The light and dark tan is wood paved, if we can call that paved, streets. The more dark, the brown and the gray color was concrete, and the greenish gray and blue were stone streets that were paved. And that is in 1872-73. There was very little paving before Alexander Shepard showed up on the scene. There was wood that was put over the streets, but the idea that this was, a charming cobblestone area is not what it looked like. It was a lot of mud to be very honest, and not much paved work. So but as a result of this development, Washington, D.C. is growing, partially due to the former slaves and other refugees who had escaped from the South and were living in the district. And the district, as I'm sure you know, was one of the first places to free the slaves before they were freed on a federal level. But prompted by this onslaught, let's call it, of population, owners of land to the north of the developed city began to improve their land. They wanted to attract new residents. They were buying and building houses, and there were a lot of this was done as speculation, not just as individually built houses. And you can see in our slide here that the growth was of middle class initially. Some of the more interesting houses, and I think you can see, we have a date on the right of the photograph, but actually on the left, it gives you the address and when the date of these buildings. There's a little background, like 1433, 1435 Q Street from 1871 to 1877. Well, why don't we know when it was built? Because, in fact, there were no permits being issued at that time, and we use tax records to determine the age of buildings that are before DC started to issue the issue building permits. So you could get an idea. And some of them, we might have newspaper articles that help us identify this. There might be photographs that were labeled, something shows up, there might be journals, or, something has helped us understand the dates of these buildings, but it's not as easy as it is when it's later on and we actually can get DC building permits that give us a date. So as you can see, we have these 2.5-story buildings, 3-story buildings, but when we move to the working class, then what we're starting to see is smaller buildings being constructed. This wonderful ad of 2 houses on Kingman Place at $3,000, 1 house on Kingman Place at $3,500, 1 lot on Kingman Place at 55 cents. I think we might all want to get that one. The fact is that this was where the working class lived, many of them supporting what will soon be a more upscale class in this area. So you can see they're more modest houses, but certainly quite lovely by our standards today, to say the least. So the circle, which was called the Iowa Circle, not Logan Circle, was named for the state of Iowa. And it was L'Enfant planned, he talked about that each of these reservations, these circles, would be named after one of the states that existed at that time. It didn't really stick as a method for naming them, but this was named Iowa Circle for quite a long time, and we'll talk about that a little later. But the circle itself, there were improvements, as you can see in this map from 1887 versus the map from 1883. There are a little bit of changes that take place, a little more intricate, and there is some information about the history of Iowa Circle's development that we're not going to go into great depth today, but is pretty interesting because the history of all of the reservations in the city and how they were landscaped or used for traffic purposes, putting roads through and the like, is very interesting and tells us a lot about Washington's growth. On the left in this slide is a Sashi map from 1883, and these are these sort of almost aerial, but we would call them orthogonal drawings. They're looking at buildings, and what's interesting is we haven't looked at every single building of every map in every city because they did them for so many cities, but we have in certain cases been able to show that these Sashi maps are very accurate. They might be sort of primitive in how they're presented, but we have been able to find that the roof structure seemed to be what actually was built there, or that they were built of brick versus stone. That so surprisingly accurate drawings, which is very nice also for historians to know. So if we let's move on to the next slide. Oh, I should say though, before I move, that in something that Alyssa was able to find out is that the land that was Iowa Circle was actually fenced in 1890 and leased to nearby property owners. So it became sort of a private area, much like we might have seen in London, where the park is available to the people who live around it. But that was a very short life because it was actually public land and became publicly accessible soon thereafter. So then we talk about what Logan Circle is most famous for and what was actually the incentive for the original historic designation. It wasn't the history of the middle class or the history of the working class or the history of Iowa Circle. It was the buildings that surround Logan Circle that prompted that designation. And the HABs, as you can see from these photographs, Historic American Building Survey has done a lot of research on the buildings. They document them and they took photographs, they found drawings if they could, they did the deed records and the like, and that information is mostly at the Library of Congress and accessible if one wanted to research more a particular building. Not every building is researched, but there's a lot of information there. So that, but nearly every building, well, let me before, was built around between 1874 and 1890. But the fact is that the land that was originally owned by one family. It was the entirety of Square 242 in the 1850s was owned by the Heitmiller family. But by 1873, it became more attractive and it was sold, subdivided the lots, and they were sold off individually. So sort of what we might see in suburban areas outside of our city today, or in the extraneous areas of the district, when large swaths of land suddenly become, there's an interest in them, they subdivide them and they can sell them. So the last building until most recently was 14 Logan Circle, which was built in 1903. Lot 10 has never been built upon, but 20 Logan Circle and 27 Logan Circle are both late 20th century buildings, or early 21st century, because 20 Logan was built in 1999 and 27 Logan in 2001. And I think it's very easy for one to see which buildings they are. Their windows proportions are a little off. Their roof is not quite, they're not as ornate. They're not as finely designed as the earlier buildings are. But the materials and styles do vary on there. And there were many individually designed buildings by prominent architects. 11 Logan Circle was, which is in this photograph on the left. Here was designed by T.F. Schneider, who designed the Cairo Hotel apartment building. And then 6 Logan Circle, for instance, was designed by Henry Searle. But we have, there are a number of Hornblower Marshall buildings on Logan Circle, and it's a very rich in architectural history. But I want to go to the next slide because it's something that Alyssa and I have recently become aware of. I don't know how many of you know about 15 Logan Circle, which is known as the Old Korean Legation. And you can see the photograph from 1893 on the left and the photograph from 2018 on the right. It looks very similar to what it looked like before. And in fact, its history is fascinating because it was the legation for the Korean government in the 1890s. But Japan, when they took over Korea, they insisted that the Koreans sell the legation to them for $5. And then Japan turned around and sold it to a private family. Sometime in the late 2000s, the 2000s, there was a group of people who decided they wanted to return the building to the Koreans. They wanted to have it be a museum of the legation that had been there. Where this idea came from, it's hard to say, but they did find that there were actually wonderful photographs of the interior of the building from the Korean legation's occupancy. And they were out in California, and they were able to find them, and they used them to recreate the rooms that were the ambassador's room. He wasn't the ambassador, but I don't even know what it's called when it's a legation. I guess he's still the ambassador. But as you can see from this photograph on the left versus the one in the center, how accurate they've tried to do the restoration. And this was owned by a number of families over the course of time. It wasn't like it was all there. They had to recreate this. And they spent a great deal of effort. It's a private foundation that did it. It's supported, at least in theory, by the South Korean government, but it is this work of this foundation that has pulled this together, and the director of the museum. So it is possible to go in there. I believe that, did we figure out that they've opened again, Alyssa, for once in a while that you can go in? Because they were open, but they closed because of the pandemic.
Yeah, and I think they haven't opened back up to the public, but I'm sure it's imminent.
Right. And it's fascinating because it is a chance to see a building as it looked in the 1890s on Logan Circle. I mean, it's the only one that you can get that much clarity of not just the architecture, but the actual furnishings that were in the building. So, yeah, it was the National Trust for Cultural Heritage of the Republic is the one who purchased it. They spent $10 million to actually do this work. All right, so moving on to the rapid growth here, we have the residential development of the upper class on Vermont and Rhode Island Avenue. So a little bit off of the actual circle itself. And you find the buildings are of the same ilk, let's say, grand 3-4-story buildings, or like the 1239 Vermont Avenue, which is from 1869 post-Civil War, which this is a photograph from after 1933 that was there. Habs was very, we get a lot of our information from Habs on these fine buildings. One of the first people to actually promote the area was Quartermaster General Montgomery Meigs, who built his house at 1239 Vermont Avenue, which is now demolished, but that's the one on the upper left-hand corner. The 1300 block of Vermont was designed by architects that included Glenn Brown, who was the first president of the Washington chapter of the AIA, James McGill, who designed LaDroit Park, the buildings there, Alfred Mullett, who you know of as the architect of the old executive office building, and C.A. Didden, who's not quite as well known, but did a lot of houses in Washington, D.C., some very nice houses in the Kalorama Triangle and Kalorama area. So in the buildings 1314 through 1318 Vermont Avenue were built between 1874 and 1876. They were the first on the block. And the 1324 Vermont Avenue was designed in 1883 by Glenn Brown, which gives you an idea that sometimes you had an individual building, sometimes you had a group of speculative buildings. And they were still aimed at more of a wealthier clientele, for sure. But as this was happening, apartment buildings were also coming into the city. The first apartment building to be built in the city was at Thomas Circle, just south of Logan Circle in 1880. And the middle class had a growing acceptance of apartment livings. But at first it was actually the well-to-do who lived in them, because they were there was the concept of tenements. So the middle class didn't want to be associated with tenements, but the upper class could move into a luxurious apartment building. There was such a distinct change, and it had to do with what was happening in New York, no question, as the New York apartment buildings started to be constructed and it became more fashionable for wealthy families to live in apartment buildings. So the Iowa apartments, I should say the Howard Inn and Gladstone, which is on the right here, 1900 through 1901, those are designed by George Cooper. What's interesting about them from just an architectural history point of view is that this is the first time in Washington, D.C., where one set of drawings is used twice. They actually are twin buildings, but it's the first incident of that. We see that all the time now, but it was not what we saw before that. So George Cooper sort of introduced this idea, and he did a number of other innovative ideas with the plan and massing of apartment buildings, but he was kind of an innovative guy who worked with developers. The Iowa apartments, obviously named after the Iowa Circle, was constructed in 1900, and this is T.F. Schneider designed this, and it's 7 stories tall, and it's towering over primarily in 2- and 3-story row houses now, and it's a Renaissance revival style as opposed to something that's more of a let's say a colonial revival mix from the Victorian era that Cooper did. So by 1910, nearly all the vacant lots were filled. Department construction slowed because there were not as many big lots, but there was some replacement of early structures, such as the Miramar Apartments, which was built in 1929, and buildings were torn down. It did not happen as frequently within the neighborhood as it did to the south, which was closer to the city center, because obviously the pressure of the value of land as we moved downtown would cause row houses to be torn down and apartment buildings that could be more productive financially. But who was living there? Well, during this period, we have a very interesting group of people. The residents came from diverse economic backgrounds, ranging from government clerks and working class families, druggists, lawyers. 1880 federal census for Corcoran Street tells us a lot about that. But prominent individuals such as William Calvin Chase, who's the editor of the Washington Bee, and his drawing of his images here. Attorney General Edward Pierpont, who lived at 1239 Vermont in the middle, and a very grim person here in his photograph. But we also have John Langford, and Langford was the first African-American who was, we believe, considered to be an architect in DC. And he designed a lot of buildings and additions to buildings in the area of the greater 14th Street area. And so by the 1880s as well, the 1500 block of P Street was one of the few integrated streets. But by the 1900, previously all white streets were integrating. Okay, so we started to see that. Land was often owned by women. It was held for their husbands. It was inherited or invested. And by 1880, this is fascinating, almost half of the owners of property on Corcoran Street were women. Now, a lot of people think, oh, aren't they independent women? Well, the truth is that it's a little more complicated. It was a very easy way for men to protect their money by putting their property in their wives' names. Because if you remember, whatever really belonged to the wife was the husband's, but the courts didn't see it quite that way. And they could protect themselves. If they were going to go bankrupt, they still had their family home. So it's not that all of, some of these women might have been quite independent and entrepreneurial, but it's not necessarily the case. So let's move on to the next slide. This is where a little bit about commercial buildings, and encouraged by the streetcar, more people living there. Commercial activity was concentrated along 14th Street, and speculative commercial structures such as 1508 14th Street began to emerge in the 1860s. That building was originally 1 story, but it expanded in 1878 to 3 stories when Kolb's was introduced. They were a confectioner, but we loved that it also functioned as a dentist's office in the 1890s. I guess you would, have your bakery and get candy and then go upstairs and, get your teeth fixed. I suppose that's the way it worked. But commercial growth continued through the 1870s, including the establishment of Riggs Market in 1877 on the 1400 block of P Street. And that's really, you can see the from the map where that was located on P Street. And I think it might be a familiar location to many of us as we move on. But the 1508 14th Street is still there today. It's because the owner of that building was trying to get a very high price from it. And when Metropolitan did the development around it, he was convinced that they needed his building to actually complete the development. But they did not. They did not pay his price. They built all around it, and it's still there today. So developers don't always pay what the owners would like. Okay, so go to the next slide. And this gives you a little more of 14th Street. What the typical thing we see is these individual buildings being constructed, or there might be a pair of buildings or a group of buildings that served various and sundry commercial purposes, with apartments usually upstairs. It was, the shopkeeper lived upstairs, or they sold it. It had apartments, but it was usually residential on the upper floors. As they became more prosperous, the second floor being used as commercial space started to happen. As you can imagine, they could afford to move out, and they did when they could get, a nicer house. So that brings us to the concept of spirituality in the area and religious institutions and buildings. There are 7 churches that were built between 1867 and 1902 as their congregations grew, because people lived there and they wanted to go to church. So Luther Place Memorial Church was designed in 1867. It's the oldest church in the neighborhood, and it was constructed as a memorial of thanksgiving for the ending of the Civil War. It's a Gothic revival style. And it was, it's still there and very beautifully placed on the circle that it's on. And then in the 1870s through 1880s, St. Luke's Episcopal Church was designed in 1879. It was designed by the African-American architect Calvin Brent, who was constructed under the supervision of a Black pastor with a Black congregation. And it's a smaller neighborhood church. But others in these 2 decades include John Wesley Methodist Church, the Vermont Avenue Baptist Church, and the Mount Olivet Baptist Church. In the 1890s, Mount Gilead Baptist Church was built, 1896, and the Grace Reformed Church from 1902, which is also that, and the St. Luke's and Luther Place. These are obviously very important historic buildings. The Grace Reformed was designed by Paul Peltz and Abel Richter. Now, Paul Peltz, obviously of the Library of Congress fame. Peltz and Smithmeyer were partners with Library of Congress, but they split up during the process of the construction of the library. And Peltz went on to design a number of buildings, including the Grace Reformed Church, also in Gothic Revival style. Now, there are public and institutional buildings. We are lucky to still have the Barrett School, which was built in 1899. It was constructed for white students, and it was named for the postmaster Gabriel Barrett. But there was also the Washington City Orphan Asylum on 14th and S, which was built in 1865 and demolished in 1963. And an old ladies' home on 13th Street between R and S was the old ladies' home. The map shows that we have here shows the location of schools. Is on the bottom right-hand side. Each of those red shows the fact that those were white schools for white students, and the blue is for the Black students, because we had a completely segregated educational system. Though we were, the District of Columbia actually did go far beyond many jurisdictions in educating African-American students, but not as far as they should have. But you can see how the neighborhood, the mix of the neighborhood by the number of schools that are there and the number of African-American schools in the area. So as we move into the 20th century, things happen. And the General Logan, who was very famous, and it was just really pushed that his statue be located on Iowa Circle. He died in 1886, and by 1891, they were really arguing that should be where it is. But what's interesting, this article that's here, it talks about Iowa Circle is one of those localities in Washington which has but recently emerged from the slums, which is very interesting because we don't see that as much. Obviously, what was going on around the circle, that was in fact slums, but there were, I think it's a product of that it was an integrated neighborhood, and it was perceived as not as good as a white neighborhood would be. And a special force was held on, to stop fights and whatever. So we can say that it was not necessarily a good time in the history of the District of Columbia, but the area was known still as Iowa Circle and Hell's Bottom. They decide that they will put the statue there. It is there. However, it is still called Iowa Circle. The middle is a picture of his house, of Logan's house, which is not on the circle, but it's near 14th and Belmont, called Calumet. So let's move to this. So it finally, as the Society of the Army of Tennessee, they were responsible for raising the money for the statue and getting Congress to approve it. But even though the park was chosen as the site in 1891, the park, which was divided by paths at the time, was redesigned to fit the monument. It was still referred to as Iowa Circle. It was only when in 1901 that they actually named it, which was 10 years after the statue had been unveiled on the site. It finally had its Congress, and the Army of Tennessee got the name changed, got Congress to change the name to Logan Circle, finally. And let's go to the next circle. So something that certainly was a surprise to me in all my research when we did work on the Greater 14th Street Historic District was the automobile row. The number of automobile showrooms and garages that were along 14th Street. The area had a streetcar. It had a lot of commercial enterprises around it. But as we move into the 20th century, it became a place for the automobiles to be sold and as well as repaired and stored. The 1907 Luttrell Company, you can see this brick building with the arched windows, and that is in 1942 is by then it was actually remodeled in the 20s because it was very out of style. This brick building with sort of Italian Renaissance feel to it didn't match the new stripped classicism that we will see on the buildings that were built for the car sales. To say about the automobile is that we know that, we have the Ford, it was named after Mr. Ford. We have the Cadillac named after Mr. Cadillac. Well, the fact is there were so many different companies producing cars, designing cars, producing cars, very much like the tech situation in the late 20th century, where everybody, first they'd all design computers, then they're all designing programs, and then they all go bust, or they join together so there's just a few of them. And that's what happened with the automobile industry. But this little photo is a nice little showing of what happened here. They actually took this red brick building, they stripped it down to make it look more modern. As I said, that happened in the 20s, not as late as 1942. That's just the photograph we have. They tried to make it look like it was more like a stripped classical building. Yeah. And then, as you can see, by 1992, it is no longer has anything to do with cars. And in fact, that, we can see in the next slide that today, this is the Sephora, and this is part of the Whitman Walker development that's on the site. This is the remnant. Actually, the facade fell during construction and had to be recreated. So what you're seeing is a recreation of what was there. But they did a very nice job. It was kind of a shock. It was an emergency situation where literally the facade was about to fail completely. And that was, it had walls, but the walls were not, the whole build, was not supporting it. So there are many of these around 14th Street. The 1526 14th Street, which if you look all the way to the right is Studio Theater, but it was one of the automobile showrooms. That's why the big openings were so that you could drive the cars into it. And the design of these buildings were particularly special as we get into the 20s and 30s. And then there's a big decline as there are fewer and fewer stores. Not that the automobile becomes unpopular, because that's certainly not the case, but it moves, and M Street starts to get automobile sales happening. So there's repairs that still take place. Church Street, for instance, had a lot of repair shops there. Rainbow Auto Works, for instance, which is now the Rainbow Apartments. So there were a number of different buildings that house this all the way as we move on 14th Street from Logan Circle moving up north. Here are some examples, but let's look at that for a second. So here's some examples. You can see how beautiful these buildings were designed. The 1522 14th Street, the 1549 14th Street. It's just really lovely. And then on the right, you can see the Church Street buildings where they were actually repair work. The one on the top right was actually a Nickelodeon, and it was then no longer popular as the big theaters were built downtown, and it became a repair shop very early, and was really good because it had its big opening that they could just move the cars in and out. Okay, next. So social changes, what happens? Well, we had a little indication of that with the story about Logan Circle and the Hell's Bottom. But the fact is that Logan Circle was lived in by some solid middle-class people. They might have been African-American, they might have been white, but they were living there. And you can see from just a couple of this what was going on in the 1930s. They finally changed this name to Logan Circle. And the bill passed that. I think I said earlier, it was earlier than that, but it was actually, you can see the bill passed in 1930. And here's a slide that shows you the image of what it looked like in 1940. Next. Here's some drawings that the Park Service has prepared, because they're responsible for the circle, because that's a federal reservation. And you can see how they ate into it to allow for traffic to be better served, the automobile being served better. It's not different from that today, having been transformed again, but still a circle, so to speak, a reservation, we should say. The neighborhood also continued to be the home to African Americans of note. Adam Clayton Powell, who some of you may remember as a congressman, African American congressman of great note. He was, well, I should say, the Belfords, Attorney Belford and Judge Marjorie Lawson, who is mentioned here, they actually rented a floor to him so that he was living in their house. And Mary McLeod Bethune lived at 1318 Vermont Avenue, and the Phyllis Wheatley YWCA was dedicated in 1920 at 901 Rhode Island Avenue, and that is the oldest YWCA in Washington, D.C., and one of the first Black ones in the entire country. It had been formed in 1905 by members of the Book Lovers Club, a literary club for Black women, and obviously named for poet Phyllis Wheatley. I happen to love this photographs because they're two men and they're playing Chinese checkers here with two women. And it's like, did they allow men to go into the YWCA? I guess they did. So that was very nice. But it's a great photograph that gives you an idea of the social activity of what was going on. But these demographic shifts would hit a very low point in 1968 when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. 4,000 troops were rushed into Washington to combat widespread burning and looting of the city. There was a curfew. They banned the sale of liquor and firearms. As they wrote, marauding bands of Negroes burned and plundered hundreds of stores. Brazen looting went on just 2 blocks from the White House. So many fires were burning, at least 100. The city's fire department could not tabulate the number. Now, these rioters were obviously pretty upset over Martin Luther King's death and the way he was assassinated, and the rioting that went on here and the looting and the damage to the stores had a very, very bad effect on 14th Street. And it soon became known as a place for drugs and prostitution. Just some more photographs of what was happening, and you can see what happened then. And many of the stores were torn down, and we lost a lot of historic fabric as a result. Others were kept there and remodeled, but it took a long time. And it seemed like a long time, from 1968 until we get into the 80s, things changed. And what changed? People started to move back into some of the abandoned houses, or they built new buildings, and the city started to get more popular. There were historic district movement was really growing in DC, and we were brought in, Traceries was brought in to look at the expansion of Logan Circle into a greater 14th Street historic district, because there were so many beautiful houses that had been neglected or abandoned, that there were a lot of, especially, I'll be honest, it was young gay men came in and saw an opportunity to make a really beautiful neighborhood again. And they were really not alone, to be certain, but they were very supportive of the effort for the historic district to be created and for their buildings to be recognized, so that they could encourage the further restoration of buildings in the area. And this photograph, it's obviously not quite as bad because we have the trees are not in bloom on the top and they are at the bottom, but it does give you a chance to see they restored the circle itself. in 1990. It was no longer getting chopped up by traffic, and it was designed so that people could actually walk. You can see all the street walk. People could actually walk across the vehicular roadway and get into the circle and actually enjoy it. And it wasn't a place that was just to be looked at or where nefarious activities took place, but a place where the neighborhood could enjoy its beauty and what was, the neighborhood itself. So let's go to the next slide. So this historic designation really made a difference, reminding everyone that in 1970s, it was 1972, that just the smaller area was designated. And then the greater 14th Street Historic District, as you can see, greatly increased the number of buildings that were protected under that and really encouraged good design to be integrated into some of these buildings that had not been, they might have been non-contributing buildings because of their condition, as I said, or that they were newer. And then it was expanded. And I think that you can see Whole Foods coming in was a really important change to the area, because that there was a group of people, I understand LCCA, I gather, was involved in really petitioning, I guess is the word, Whole Foods to choose Logan Circle area for Greater 14th Street for its site, and to bring this grocery store to that area, which obviously everyone loved that there was a Whole Foods there. I think I didn't do a complete study of that, but I think it was very well received, bringing that into the neighborhood. And it also, Metropolis across the street, they built buildings that had new retail at the at ground level, restaurants and the like, and it really changed this area of Greater 14th Street into a new and exciting place to live. Part of this was encouraged by the arts districting that zoning put in, that the studio theater used to become, that was an attraction, that studio theater would come in and open there. But the reputation still, carried on. And there was a famous story about the prostitutes being walked across the bridge into Virginia. And the Virginia jurisdiction government wasn't very happy about this decision, but it was, there were prostitutes there that went away. And in 1986, the Frank D. Reeves Municipal Center opened to the north at 14th and U, which brought government workers every day into the area. Whitman Walker Clinic opened. And obviously now they're really, they've developed their site into a beautiful building by Annabelle Seldorf from New York. Really very exciting. So this changed what was going on in this area. And when we did the original expansion, not this expanded Greater 14th Street, but the name was, what should it be named? And I thought it should be named Greater 14th Street, because I thought that included everything on both sides and up and down the block. There was a lot of concern about that, because they said, well, that means 14th Street is prostitutes, 14th Street is drugs. But I knew the history, that was a very short time in 14th Street's history where there were prostitutes and drugs, and it's gone. It was just this little blip. And I'm glad to know I was right, that it no longer had a negative connotation at all. I guess I was lucky that I was right about that. But I probably should have thought it Mid-City. The post office was called the Mid-City Station. That would have been a good name as well. But I think identifying 14th Street as its name and its geographic area, I thought, really brought a lot into its understanding of its history. The couple of other slides we have here, I want to show the next ones. Just to end you, is that this reminding you of when it was listed, what is the area, and the many different places that you are aware of. Obviously, we have 14th Street, but we have nightlife, we have theater, and there's more than the studio theater. There were smaller theaters that are no longer, unfortunately, because of the pandemic. But the things are certainly changing with the pandemic, and I think living in this area within these so many beautiful houses that are here is something that everything is is very positive. I have a question here. What was it? I don't know where the question of Hell's Bottom came from, but we're
I can
going to try
actually
to
answer
find
that
out.
if
Oh,
you
you
want.
can? Oh, good.
I can, yeah. So it came after the Civil War, when people, as Emily said, people started to move into the city. And there was a lot more Blacks coming into the city, really just trying to find housing, any sort of housing, as they were fleeing the South, trying to get opportunities. And the area east of the Circle ended up putting up basically shanty houses, smaller frame dwellings that within several years became of slum quality. And as people were moving in, this area also found it was subject to lots of murders and other crime rates. And this is not too dissimilar. Downtown, there were several neighborhoods called Dead Man's Hollow. There was another Murder Bay. So there were these little enclaves that were really kind of focused in alleys and the surrounds and really hidden from the street, but they were basically slums. But specifically for Hell's Bottom, there was a liquor law that went into effect that prevented any new liquor stores going in 1891. So after that, the neighborhood started to turn around and people ended up moving and dispersing elsewhere in order to find liquor. So says the story. And after that, the neighborhood started to improve, and as more development and spec houses were being developed in the area, it really transformed into the beginnings of 20th century Logan Circle.
And Pam also asked the question about why didn't it go to U Street? And that is a question. While this was going on, there were people who were very interested in U Street, and they really, having been centered around Logan Circle and moving up 14th Street, they were coming from the north going down. There were other groups interested in the area. And the U Street corridor as the center of culture of African-American entertainment was something that was of interest. So there was a group they have a group of houses were called Strivers, the Strivers Row. And they were houses built by white people who then left, and then African-Americans bought them. And the idea was that they were striving to be middle class. And, you get to a point where it's like, well, sometimes it's very easy where the definitions of the boundaries are, and sometimes it's a little harder. Certainly 16th Street is a really strong boundary. And there was a historic district that is, if you look at this map, that all these buildings, they're relating to 16th Street, whereas the ones that are on the back side were coming off of the 14th Street and 15th Street. And it has to do with the 14th Street was the commercial area. 15th Street was more residential. But it was, it could have gone that far. And maybe one could say, well, this could be less large, that this could be more compact, and maybe just, have it be really on 14th Street and let 15th Street exist on its own. But I don't think there's a good answer to your question, other than it has to do with, trying to understand the history. And to be honest, what the research that we did in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s is just so primitive compared to what we can learn today. The internet has changed our ability to have access to information. I mean, we used to use an index to the Star newspaper that someone had typed up. There was no index to the Washington Post. So you would have had to spend every hour just going through newspaper after newspaper after newspaper, trying to find articles. Now we don't do that anymore. We just click some buttons on our computer and these articles pop up. And so there's never been huge amounts of money available for these surveys. And they are surveys. They are very much reconnaissance. They're not in-depth studies of any particular buildings. And say we learn things that we didn't know before. Hell's Bottom, I didn't know until, she pulled that article up. I'd never known that it was called that. And I just learned why it was called that from her today. So, if we were to look at this, we might argue for something differently. Logan Circle, why did they do Logan Circle? Was done simply because of its architecture and the fancy people who lived there. They didn't really know how Logan Circle fit into anything. And that's when we came around and we said, wait a minute, it's an overlay. Logan Circle isn't the center. 14th Street was the spine. It was the center of everything. This was just a little arm of, nice houses over here. So trying to understand the history makes us change our boundaries pretty often. And, but there's often very little patience among, I won't say the Historic Preservation Review Board, but, they're not there trying to refine the history as much as they're trying to protect what's there, if that makes sense. So, have other questions? Did you ask Pam if you're talking? You're on mute. You want to talk to us?
Oh, sorry.
Oh,